the bitter history of the loss of Panama is not something that Colombians, modern Colombians, dwell on, is it?
They do dwell on it.
Oh,
Yeah, well, the Colombian point of view is very clear. This is not our drug war, it's your drug war. And they point to the United States.
Dr. LaRosa, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me.
Thank you.
Let's start our conversation about Colombia
Okay.
with Panama. And you may say, well, that's interesting. Why Panama? Because as we all know, Panama was part of Colombia. It's a story that most Americans don't know about, and regrettably, some Americans don't even care to know about.
Right.
So, and I'm particularly excited to speak with you, Dr. La Rosa, about this subject because you've written a book on this. It is titled The United States Discovers Panama. So let's get started. Please give us the background to this when Panama was part of Colombia.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I co-edited a book with Germán Mejia, who's a very prominent historian in Bogota. He's a
Mhm.
good friend of mine. We went to the same graduate program together at the University of Miami and
Wonderful.
became friends. He's an expert on the Colombian city, the city of Bogota. He discovered in Colombia that there were all kinds, many articles published in Harper's Magazine and the
Yeah,
Atlantic
yeah.
Monthly in the middle of the 19th century that dealt with Panama. And so he was interested in that.
U.S.
And
journals publishing about Panama in the 19th century.
that's right. Yeah. And
Interesting.
remember, Harper's begins in 1850. Their first edition has an article in it about Panama in 1850. So he was
Wow.
like,
Wow.
and as a proud Colombian, Herman, my co-author or co-editor, he said, let's look into this a little further and see if we can put something together, a proposal or a book or whatever. And the result is this edited collection called The United States Discovers Panama. And the subtitle's kind of cute. It's The Writings of Soldiers, Scholars, and Scoundrels. And
Scoundrels. I love that.
so we basically collected these articles and published them in an organized manner and explained how the history sort of unraveled itself. So back in literally the mid 19th century, 1850, our interest is peaked with regard to Panama. Now, it goes back earlier than that. It actually starts around 1848 or in the 1840s, because as you know, the United States acquired a tremendous amount of land in 1848 via the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
Is
We had
that
a,
the U.S. Mexico War?
you bet it. No, yep,
President Polk?
yep, that
Yep.
all
Okay.
happened. And that was an unpleasant war. It was a big war.
Yeah.
It wasn't an easy war, as we tend to depict it or not depict it in our history because we don't like to talk about that war
Yeah.
because it was just simply a land grab. That's it.
Yeah.
There was no
Yeah.
higher purpose to it whatsoever. And it gave us about 50%. I'm sorry, it gave us about 30% of our national territory, excluding Alaska,
Yeah.
and it eliminated about 50% of Mexico's territory. So it's a big deal. And
Wow.
so
Okay.
suddenly, with all that territory, and then, as you know, being a Californian, the California gold rush, 1848, 49, gold's discovered. Suddenly, East Coasters, people in Baltimore or Philadelphia or Boston, New York, they wanted to get to the West Coast fast.
Okay. Okay. And how does that transition into our interest into Colombia, or is it happening at the same time, sort of concurrently with that?
All this is happening at the same time.
Okay.
And prior to this period in the 1840s, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who has a university 200 miles down the road, Vanderbilt University,
Yeah.
he,
Yeah. Who was a railroad tycoon at that time?
absolutely. He made his money in railroads and transportation and in other ways. And he had developed a route through Nicaragua that basically took passengers overland across the lake Nicaragua, overland again into the Pacific. And that route was, the word is clunky, difficult. It was easier than going around the tip of South America,
Yeah, yeah,
obviously,
yeah.
steamship. But that route was seen as sort of clunky, difficult, problematic. And there was always this desire to put a route through Panama, right? And so now, once the railroad technology got developed during this time period from 1850 to 1855, 5 years, 50 miles of railroad were built through Panama, and it opened in 1855, making the Vanderbilt route obsolete overnight.
Oh,
So
wow.
suddenly, Panama in 1855, once this railroad gets established, becomes the place to move across the isthmus, be a comfortable, modern. I mean, this was high tech at the time. Who
Yeah,
thinks of railroads as high tech? Nobody, but
yeah. Yeah.
incredible at this time to think, oh my God, in a couple of hours you could cross the isthmus via this railroad. I took Amtrak last week, and let me tell you, it's not high tech.
It's not high tech.
I
I,
mean, they're
I,
trying, but
I've taken many trains in the East Coast, and you're right. It's not
yeah.
high tech like it used to be back in the earlier in the 20th century. Anyway, so does the U.S. establish some sort of interest in Panama, which is then called the Department of Panama with the country of Colombia? How does this play out?
Panama is a department of Colombia at the time. It's attached to Colombia. It's part of Colombia.
Like a province?
Exactly.
Okay.
And so, but the problem is this, and this is something that Colombian experts don't really have a handle on. People in Bogota, the elites in Bogota, and they were elite men from elite families, they had absolutely no regard for Panama whatsoever. They didn't care about the people there. They didn't understand the people there. They never went there. The only thing they did was take tax revenues from there and return nothing in services, right? It's a story that goes way back in history. But Panamanians were seen as connected to the Caribbean. Many of them were formerly enslaved people. Many of them were people of color. Many of them were seen as not civilized, right? This is from the perspective of the elites who lived and ruled at Bogota, a capital city that was far away from the coast. It took a month to get from Panama up to Bogota at that time, prior to aviation. So
Yeah.
there's giant disconnect between the capital city and the province of Panama. There's no leadership in Bogota. People cared about the people of Panama, and that's kind of how the story unfolds. The story further unfolds, and I'll tell you a little bit about this via a treaty called Hey Herran, which is the treaty that established that the United States wanted to put a canal in Panama. And that's the treaty that establishes it in 1903. The American Senate accepted the treaty, ratified the treaty. The Colombian Senate rejected it.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's an important point. But before we sort of unravel that point, you brought up something really interesting. The perspective of Colombian elite towards Panama, which also sheds light on what Panamanians thought of their national government back then, back in Bogota. They don't care about us.
They
They
don't care
just
about
we're just sort of this backwater area, which turns out to be central to world commerce, shipping traffic later on. Anyway,
that's
um,
an extremely
is
valid point. Yeah.
is this why Panamanians went through several revolutions, like rebellions, in the 19th century? And I think the U.S. even helped crush those rebellions, help Colombia crush them.
Yes, the Panamanians were seen as a kind of, they saw themselves as a disrespected outlier in Colombian history. They didn't feel attached to Colombian history. They felt attached to the greater Caribbean. They could get to Mobile, Alabama, or to New Orleans or to Tampa much faster than they could get to Bogota. So they're
Oh,
connected to that
wow.
world, just in terms of transportation, prior to aviation, of course. And so that's the world that they're in. And so elites in Bogota looking down on them, taking their tax revenues and returning nothing in services, they weren't happy with the structure structure of governance. And so when an opportunity emerged via the Hay-Arran Treaty in 1903 for them to become a world player, right, a world entity, an important place on the map, and the Colombian Senate simply rejects it, they get very upset. And they had every good reason to get upset. They saw this as their one opportunity, not to become wealthy, but to become something, to become important, to become significant, to become talked about in world history and world affairs. And so the Colombians simply saying, the Colombian elite in Bogota simply saying, no, we're rejecting it, was a real problem. Now, there are reasons why the Colombians rejected the treaty.
I was just going to ask that. Wouldn't that make, bring in revenue for Colombia to have some sort of canal that connects the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific Ocean?
I think it was $10 million and $250,000 for 100 years rent every year. So it was a lot of money.
Back then, yeah,
A
yeah.
ton of money, but we would be renting a 6 mile territory, a 6 mile strip through Colombia, which we would militarize and we would completely control. These were the terms of Hey Arran. But the Colombians didn't. The Colombians had just fought or had just concluded the War of 1,000 Days. Now, that war concluded in 1902, and it's the last, it's the final war in the 19th century wars in Colombia. And Garcia Marquez, the great Colombian writer, was asked how many wars were there, civil wars in Colombia in the 19th century. He says, I have no idea. And, that's what he wrote about, right? So, so
Yeah,
many of them people lost track. And uh, I'm not saying this in a disrespectful way to Colombia. I'm just saying it's a complicated country to unify, right?
yeah,
It
yeah.
remains that way today. So War of 1,000 Days happens. The Colombians had just concluded that war in 1902, 70,000 dead, a true civil war with all of the horrors that civil wars entail, a completely divided country, and then they're expected to negotiate with an up and coming power in the North, the United States in 1903. They said, we don't want to do it. We're not ready to negotiate with the United States. And that was their rationale for tearing up or not accepting or not ratifying the treaty, Harran in 1903.
So there was no substantive reason. It was just like, hey, the timing is not right. Is that fair to conclude that?
It's fair to conclude that the substantive reasons were we don't like the militarization of our country by the United States Army or the United States military because it was going to be we are going to rent this territory and militarize it and control it. And they said that interferes with our sovereignty. And
Okay, that's kind of a big deal.
it's kind of a big deal. Some say that they were holding out for more money. There are a lot of theories about what happened, but in the end, Teddy Roosevelt got a little upset and referred to Colombians as, quote, those contemptible little creatures, right? Which isn't very nice. It's not
It's
very
not, no.
diplomatic. He
Yeah,
said some
yeah,
other
yeah.
things too, which I'm not going to repeat on our podcast,
Wow.
our family-friendly podcast. But he was livid, and he said, "I am going to build the canal. That's it." And he goes on to say famously, "I took Panama," and he basically staged or helped to organize a rebellion in Panama City. Since we owned part of the railroad, the Colombian troops couldn't move to Panama City to assist with the putting down of the rebellion. And in 3 days, on November 3rd, 1903, Panama emerged. It's
Oh,
that simple.
wow.
Not a drop of blood was shed.
So what happens in Colombia? So, you talked about the elite. The news comes that Panama has seceded and
Right.
America was involved in this.
Mhm.
What's the reaction? This to this sort of backwater province that they didn't care about up to that point, really?
Well, the reaction in Bogota is indignation, right? The Colombian honor has been shattered, right? Their sense of of nationhood has been disturbed. They're literally a part of their country has been cut off, right? And they could do nothing about it. Right. We put the USS Nashville in the Caribbean, which was a big impressive warship at the time. Colombians had nothing like it. And we said, this is it. It's an independent province. We're going to sew the flag. We're going to put together the flag. It's an independent nation, rather. And
Yeah.
Colombia exists as of November 3rd, 1903. The Colombians could only send angry diplomatic letters and notes, which they did, and freeze all diplomatic relations with the United States, which happened. And that went on for about a generation.
A
There was
generation. Wow.
Oh yeah, really until the middle of the 19 teens. It's 10, 12, 14 years. There's been virtually no diplomatic relations between the United States and Colombia.
Was there any reaction from other South American countries at the time?
Yeah, I mean, they expressed solidarity with Colombia,
Hmm.
as they were, as logically they would, but they all recognized, right, that there was something emerging to the north, a power potent, and they didn't really want to kind of mess with it. And so it's kind of interesting to see history repeating itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, uh, it's kind of the same thing. And I'll just add this obsession with Panama by Mr. Trump is baffling to me. I maybe he knows this history. I'm not sure. But up until Sunday, Colombia was our leading ally in Latin America and the Caribbean. There's absolutely no doubt about it, right? Anybody who knows about Latin America will tell you what I just said is true. Our leading ally, our leading friend, our leading partner. And it's been that way for quite some time, maybe 25 or 30 years or longer, depending on who
Yeah.
you think.
Um, Before we move on from that segment, and you just queued us up for the subsequent segments by talking about Colombia being our leading ally in South America, I want to uh, make sure I don't miss this question. The bitter history of the loss of Panama is not something that modern Colombians dwell on, is it?
They do dwell on it.
Oh,
They dwell
okay.
on it. And in fact, when I first went to Colombia on a Fulbright scholarship in 1993, I was taken to a theatrical production. I mean, this was a while ago, but 1993 is not a century ago. It's
It's not. No, no,
30
no.
years ago.
Yeah.
And the theatrical production was called I Took Panama. And it's hilarious. It's a satire criticizing the Colombian elite at the time and how they mismanaged the country completely, and the kind of aggressive, masculine, muscular nature of the U.S. Marines. It's a very funny production. And everybody of a certain age, let's say my age, I'd say between 40 and 100 years old, has seen this production because it's a very well-regarded theatrical production in Colombia. I don't know if it's being offered right now, but it
Yeah.
was back then. So Colombians, I don't want to say they obsess on it, but they know it. They know this history. It's absolutely true. They learn about this history and they know about it. Just like the Mexicans are taught about the history of their encounter with the United States too. They don't call it the Mexican-American War. They call it the War of North American Aggression. It's
Wow.
a very different definition of a conflict, and it's a very different way to understand what actually happened during that time.
Did the U.S. have some guilty feelings afterwards, some remorse? Did they? I know some money was paid.
To Mexico or Colombia?
Colombia. I'm sorry, to
Oh,
Colombia for the loss of Panama.
yeah, an indemnity was paid in 1921,
Mhm.
and that was $25 million. But here's an important point. We never issued an apology. We refused to apologize. And that's all the Colombians wanted. They they wanted the money, obviously. Who doesn't
Obviously.
want 25 million,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah,
that was a lot of money
yeah.
in 1921 terms.
Still a lot of money,
They
but
wanted a one sentence apology. It never happened, right? So that tells you a little bit about the relative power imbalance between these two countries. No apology was issued.
yeah.
Still haven't.
We'll be back after a short break to talk about a part of Colombia's history that I recently learned about. It's called School of the Americas. We'll be
Oh,
right back.
right. Thank you.
Dr. LaRosa, I want to speak with you about Colombia's more recent history, and you're the perfect historian to do this with, because you and your colleagues are the authors of a relatively recent book titled Colombia, a Concise Contemporary History. So let's start with this. What is Plan Lazo? I've come across this several times in readings, not just for preparation for this conversation, but just over the years. Plan Lazo.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know how it's spelled. Sometimes it's spelled Laso and sometimes it's spelled Lazo,
I've
right?
seen both actually. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
yeah, 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 yeah.
So I've repeated that mistake. I've asked for clarification on it from other people, but nobody's been able to clarify.
Yeah.
Paul Angelo, my colleague in Washington, he's a political scientist, a very smart guy, wrote From Peril to Partnership, kind of the definitive study of U.S. military relations with Colombia. And you might want to include him on your list of guests. But Plan Lazo is simply a military agreement between the United States and Colombia, right? And it happened, I'm pretty sure, during the Kennedy
Yeah,
administration,
yeah.
right? But prior to the Kennedy administration, a lot had happened in Colombia where Colombians were seen as capable administrators, capable managers,
Huh.
ruling over a democracy, right? With prudent, well-trained economists and theoretically sophisticated people running the government, running the country, right?
That sounds
So
great.
yeah, I know, and
Okay.
people don't know this history. The United States and Colombia have been allies, right? There was a terrible time at the beginning of the 20th century when things fell apart completely.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
since the 1920s or so, since when oil was discovered in Colombia in 1921, the United States and Colombia have been partners, really. There have been ups and downs, but Plan Lazo is a military agreement that's pretty important. It goes back to the 1947 Rio Pact, which was a hemispheric agreement that if one country is attacked, all countries would see this as an attack. It's a mutual aid hemispheric agreement. It also goes back to the 1948 Bogota meeting where the charter of the OAS was developed, right? After World War II, there's this desire to bring the nations of Latin America together under our leadership and protection, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because we all know, or many of us know, that the United States emerges as the most potent and important power in the West, or maybe even the world, after World War II. And so
Yeah.
we took that role seriously. We developed hemispheric alliances with Latin America, and Colombia was a leading ally. So Plan Lazo is a security arrangement and a funding program to fund the Colombian military at that time,
Oh, wow.
especially
Okay.
especially during the Kennedy administration, especially after the big scare, which is called the Cuban Revolution in 1959.
The big scare. Okay.
Well, yeah, so Cuba caught us by surprise. And people who weren't paying attention in Washington were just kind of surprised that Fidel Castro was able to do what he was able to do. And we thought, wow, we can push him out of power. And the Bay of Pigs, that didn't work. And everything that we tried against Fidel Castro didn't work. He just consolidated more power, more power, more power, and changed the country in his direction gradually over his time in office.
Okay. From there, that partnership, uh, we go into what is called School of the Americas. I'd love to hear about that because that's something that's important, um, especially in our military arrangements with Colombia. And along all of this, if you want to talk about FARC as well, please do.
Yeah, well, the School of the 46, 47, 48 are the key dates here. 46 in 1946 is when the School of the Americas was established, right? And the School of the Americas, I think, was originally in Panama because once we settled that territory, the canal zone, it becomes an American base. It becomes American territory abroad. That's what
Mhm.
the canal was. And up until the year 2000, the Carter Torrijos Treaty sort of changed all that and returned that land and territory back to Panama. But the School of the Americas was kind of, if you think about it, geographically in the center of the United States and Latin America in Panama.
Yeah.
And it was a way for us to sort of monitor activities and provide training to Latin American militaries there at a place that was conveniently located between both places. It moved to Fort Benning, which was later renamed Fort Moore, which is in Georgia.
Mhm.
Um, Benning was a Confederate general, I believe, and so he, we had to change the name, which is a
Yeah,
good thing. Those are
yeah,
those are good moves, I think.
there you go.
Um, and so the School of the Americas has been referred to as the School of the Assassins, right?
Oh, wow.
By the critics, because a lot of the people who trained there uh, went on to become some of the leaders of some very reprehensible regimes in Latin America, right? And that includes Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, places where military dictatorships took over. In the case of Colombia, you brought up the FARC. I didn't. But in the case of Colombia, the School of the Americas trained the militaries of Latin America and the military of Colombia to fight against insurgents such as the FARC, a group that developed in the 1960s and finally laid down their weapons in 2016, just a few years ago. And that was
1960s to 2016. Wow, that's a
yeah.
long run.
Oh boy, they were around for more than 50 years.
Yeah.
And they they never took over the Colombian government. I don't think they ever really wanted to, but they raised a lot of money. They were powerful. They were rich. It's just incredible how much money they had, and they had the money by protecting the narco the farm or the drug industry, the
Yeah.
drug
Yeah.
industrial complex there. And they had money by kidnapping, by extortion, by doing all kinds of illegal actions, shaking down people. They literally control billions of dollars.
So
They were,
was the School of America, which was dubbed as the School of the Assassins, did it have offices in Colombia as well, or were they training Colombian officers in the U.S. and sending them back to Colombia?
that's my understanding of it.
Yeah.
My understanding is that most of the training was done first in Panama, and then when the school was kicked out of Panama, essentially it moved to
Yeah.
Fort Benning, and the training was done in Georgia. Uh,
Yeah.
and so not just Colombia, but other armies and military personnel in Latin America. You know, prior to the United States, a proper military education was commissioned by the French, right? The French military missions were the ones that were seen as the most sophisticated, seen as the most technologically savvy. But that all kind of fell apart after World War I and World War II, and the United States came in and took over
Yeah.
those commands, particularly in Latin America, where we had much more vested interest and were closer.
Yeah. So you mentioned the drug industry, and for anyone who was old enough to understand news in the 1980s and 1990s, you remember during Reagan and Bush Senior, and then Clinton presidencies, Colombia was on the news, in American news, quite often, actually, as
Yep.
far as countries other countries go. So instead of sort of chronicling or going through this history of the drug trade and drug war, are there any themes or highlights that you want our audience to know about this? For example, I don't know, Colombians' point of view on this, whatever you wish to share.
Yeah, well, the Colombian point of view is very clear. This is not our drug war, it's your drug war. And they point to the United States. And they're not entirely wrong. In other words,
Hmm.
if if the market disappeared for this product, which is cocaine, which we manufacture here in Colombia. There's no doubt about that. If that market overnight disappeared, right, we wouldn't be having these problems here, right? And now the problems are more in Mexico and Central America. They're still in Colombia, right? Because Colombia still does produce and ship processed cocaine. the coca leaves and the pasta basica comes from other places, Bolivia, Peru, from the region, right?
Mhm.
So the Colombians have a very different view. They're like, you consume a product that we produce. It's a basic law of economics, supply and demand, and we pay the price with our lives, with damage to our infrastructure, with a war that went on and raged for 10 years from 1984 to the end of Pablo Escobar in 1993. It was a terrible time in Colombia. Terrible time. Pablo Escobar was this figure almost out of a novel, right? People couldn't believe that he emerged, and he was audacious. He was obnoxious. He built his own zoo. That we know about that, and he was a caricature of things gone badly in Colombia, and people were afraid of him. He was paying $100 to murder police officers via sicario.
Wow.
He had power. He assassinated a fellow named Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, who was the equivalent of the Attorney General, the Minister of Justice in 1984. And that's when things really fell apart. When Lara was killed in 1984, the country, I don't want to say fell apart. It didn't fall apart, but it realized that this was a problem that had to be dealt with, and that was Pablo Escobar and his henchmen and the drug trade. But the Colombian military wasn't adequately trained or equipped or prepared to fight against him because he had his own army. And so that's what was so crazy about this whole time period in Colombia. And the Colombian people on the streets, and I was there at the time, they were flummoxed by the whole thing. And they pointed the finger to the United States and to Western Europe and to other countries that used the products that they exported.
Did we help Colombia militarily to put down this? We haven't put down the drug trafficking; it's still happening. But yeah, tell me about that. How do we get engaged with that?
Well, like I say, the main drug war, right, was a 10-year, approximately a 10-year period from 1994 to, excuse me, from 1984 till Pablo Escobar's death in 1983, 1984 to 1993. There's a 10-year period. He's killed in Medellin in 1993. And by the way, 20,000 people went to his funeral in Medellin.
Wow.
What does that tell you? I mean, he understood something that people, that the government in Colombia didn't understand, and that is he provided parks and recreation to people. He gave people loans. He supported people. He was chummy with his people in the outskirts of Medellin, poor people who had nothing and who had no faith in the government and who had no connection to the government. They didn't see the government at all. Pablo Escobar filled in that role for them. I'm
Kind of
not
acted like a government of his own.
absolutely. And that's why 20,000 people showed up at his funeral. I was in Colombia. I was amazed by that. I was still learning about Colombia back then. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, okay. But those are universal lessons, right? That people should learn. And so he was a bad guy. There's no doubt about it. And so he is killed in 1993. And the United States realizes that because most of the product was coming toward us, that we needed to do something. And so during those days, during that time period, the United States military relationship with Colombia improves or becomes stronger. And it kind of ebbs and flows until something comes about called the Plan Colombia in the year 2000.
Plan Colombia.
Yeah. Plan Colombia. It happened in 2000. It's not really related to the drug trade, but it's not related to the drug trade, if that makes sense. It basically was an attempt to say there's too much violence in Colombia. The FARC, the insurgency, seems to have grown to 30,000 men, women, and children in arms,
Wow.
and they are really holding the nation hostage. We need to stop it. So we invested $1.3 billion, which was an enormous amount of money at the time. It's third after Israel and Egypt, I believe, in terms of U.S. military aid. And that number has ballooned to probably $12 billion from 2000 to the present. It's a lot of money in mostly military aid, right? And that went to Colombia, and it had some it had some effects, some positive effects. It had some negative effects because when you dump that much money into a country that's not really ready to receive that much military aid, some things go wrong, right? And there are many cases of stuff going wrong. But basically, I think that money, and Paul Angelo would agree with me on this, that country got everybody to the peace table, to the negotiating table between 2012 and 2016, and we eliminated the FARC in 2016.
We
They
being Americans.
no, well, the Colombians did it, but the Americans paid for it with this Plan Colombia money. So
So, what do you say to Americans who are listening right now to
yeah,
your uh, story, to your telling of what happened, and they come and say, "Look, Colombians should be thankful that we Americans have helped our country become more stable, more secure, that there's a market here. You're sending us bad stuff. That's not our problem. This is a Colombian problem, has always been a Colombian problem." What do you say to that?
you know, and people do say that.
Yeah, yeah.
There's no doubt about it. And Colombians are grateful to Americans. The Colombians,
Are?
yeah, I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
they really are. I mean, it's a it's a very odd dynamic, right? When Americans show up in Bogota, they're welcomed, right? And they always have been because during the bad old days, right? Very few Americans went to Colombia. Americans went to Mexico and Argentina and Brazil, and people kind of avoided Colombia. So
Yeah.
when Americans showed up in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. I showed up in the late 80s. We were welcome. And people said to us, "What are you doing here? Why are you here?" They were very accommodating, very welcoming. Scholars say this all the time, just how gracious and kind Colombians were. So many Colombians do have that attitude. We're very grateful for everything that America's done. We admire American culture. We admire the American democratic system. But we wish, right, the Colombians would have a little bit of a more open aperture, that Americans would have a little more of an open aperture about how this drug trade and how this narcotics problem has deeply impacted us and affected us, right? Because it has. And then there are a lot of people who can't get out of the country. They're kind of trapped in Colombia. And so we want Americans to understand that this war is complicated for us and it makes our life difficult, right?
Um,
Um,
in the 1980s, when you started visiting Colombia, was it safe to just walk around the streets?
No.
No.
But 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 it wasn't unsafe. And people ask me that all the time. Were you a target? No. I was a poor graduate student from the University of Miami
Yeah.
trying to figure out Colombia. Nobody cared about me, right? I
Yeah.
wasn't wealthy. I wasn't important. I wasn't an executive from Exxon.
Yeah.
Didn't have a bodyguard detail. I was just a student, and there were a lot of students around. There were probably more students in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and other places in Latin America, Chile, Peru. But no, Colombians were very kind to me always and extraordinarily open. They opened their homes to me, and I'm still friends with some of the people that from that time period, the late 80s.
That's a wonderful story. Let's take a break here. We'll be back to talk about imperialism, immigration, and presidents Trump and Petro. We'll be right back.
Thanks. For better or for worse. Yeah.
Yeah, for better or for worse. Dr. LaRosa, when it comes to Colombia, there's so much detail, but sometimes a lot of those details can be set aside by just looking at the map. When you look at the map, I mean, it's hard to miss. Colombia is kind of like the corridor to the north. I mean, there's if you're going to travel via land, you have to go through Colombia. There's no other way. So, what are the domestic issues in Colombia as more and more immigrants are coming north? Even Haitians that lived in Chile or Brazil, they came land based through Colombia. What are the domestic issues as these masses of immigrants traverse their country?
Well, this is a recent phenomenon. I'm glad you brought this up because it's super important. Colombia is uniquely situated in South America with a Pacific and an Atlantic or a Caribbean coast. All right.
Yeah,
So it occupies that space.
only South American country to do that.
That's exactly true.
Yeah,
And that takes us back to Panama. You know, it's why Panama was so crucial,
yeah.
not because of its beautiful tropical trees or people, but because of its ubication, its location, period.
Yeah, yeah,
And interestingly, in the Panama book, the technicians who go down there never comment on the people. The people who were living there were sort of seen as, people that could be pushed out of the way if necessary. You know, it's kind of sad.
oh, it is sad.
We
Okay.
need more of an anthropological view on that.
Yeah,
But it was
yeah,
all about technology, all about trains, all about movement of Americans from one coast to the other.
yeah.
And that's how we get Panama. But, the modern migration through Colombia is very significant, and people have arrived to Colombia from all parts of the world, not just South America, but India, the Middle East, Africa, everywhere. And they eventually arrive, let's say, to Brazil, and they make the trek through Brazil. Brazil and Colombia share a border, and they arrive in Bogota, and then they have to get from Colombia. Let's assume that they want to get to the United States through the Darien Gap. Darien is the jungle that separates Colombia from Panama. It's a brutal
And it's been
jungle.
in the news for the last 5, 6 years and here in the US. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. And, there are no roads there. There's no infrastructure there. People have to walk. Los caminantes, the walkers is what they call them. But most of the people passing through there now have been Venezuelans, right? Venezuela has lost 1/4 of its population in the past 10 or 15 years.
Wow.
It's
Wow.
an incredible story that the American media has been reporting on, but hasn't been reporting on enough. And the fact is, this guy, Maduro, who runs the place, is not a great guy. He just stole the last election, just blatantly stole it. It wasn't even close. We sent in the OAS team, our OAS team of observers. They're very good. The Jimmy Carter people were in there. The Carter Center sends in a team
Yeah.
also. Everybody agreed that this election last year was completely stolen and rigged. He just stole it. So people are desperate. They're desperate to leave, and so they've been walking through Colombia, through the Darien Gap, through Panama, and arriving to Central American countries, eventually arriving to Mexico, and hopefully on to the United States. Well, that's all changed since 8 days ago,
Yeah.
because people aren't being allowed to apply for asylum. It's a real problem, right? Our country, the United States of America, has always been kind of a place of last resort. People don't want to go from Venezuela to Honduras, right? And no, I don't mean to be disrespectful to the
Yeah.
people of Honduras, but they want to get to the United States or to Canada, but Canada's too cold,
Too
and
far. Yeah.
they really want to get to the United States. They understand it as a place of opportunity. They understand that there is a need for labor in the United States, and many of them have relatives or contacts in the United States, which facilitates things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Also, 55 million people speak Spanish in the United States.
Yeah.
I think it's a difference. So, Colombia has been pretty good about helping people move through their country. Many Venezuelans stay in Colombia. I know some of them. They've been working there and trying to eke out a living. It's a Colombians and Venezuelans are primos. They're cousins, basically. They're
Yeah.
kind of related, but they're cousins that don't really like one another. And that goes back to the 19th century of Simon Bolivar, but that's another podcast.
That's
And
another podcast.
but so the Colombians have been supporting the Venezuelans. They've been trying to help them. They've been offering plans for them to stay. But there's been a tremendous amount of social pressure in Colombia because every time there's a crime in Bogota, they blame the Venezuelans. right?
Oh my God, that
Every-
almost sounds like what we do. We blame immigrants for our crimes here, and Colombians do the
Exactly,
same. Oh
exactly.
wow.
It's the same situation.
You said
So
Colombians are offering plans for Venezuelans to stay in Colombia?
yes, they're offering. There are probably 1.5 million Venezuelans in Colombia. That's a lot of people.
That's a
Now,
lot of
remember,
people, yeah.
Colombia is not a rich country. It's a mid-level country, a moderately developed country. The economy is doing well, or was doing well up until recently. They've helped out. They're offering, housing. They're offering guarantees of jobs, healthcare to migrants, which is what you should do, really. And but not all Colombians are in agreement with this plan, and many Colombians think that too much emphasis is being given to supporting the Venezuelans, right? Who are in a terrible situation.
Yeah,
Terrible
yeah.
situation.
So I need to sort of correct what I said earlier. Colombia is not just a corridor. It's actually a lot of immigrants are actually settling there. They have programs. Um, this is a bit of a tangent, but yeah, I'm just going to share my opinion here. Doesn't it make sense then to give Colombia a lot of economic aid so that it and have Colombia help more immigrants to settle
Yeah,
there?
of course.
Huh.
Absolutely. And
Uh,
that goes for Central American countries too. But the Central American countries is an out migration from Guatemala, from Honduras, from El
yeah,
Salvador,
yeah,
from Northern Triangle countries, and there are real problems there.
yeah,
And Mexico ultimately becomes the place where everyone congregates,
yeah,
right? Because it's kind of the last stop before you get to the United States.
yeah.
And
So,
so, yeah.
so is immigration to just cap off this discussion? So, is immigration a political issue in Colombia like it is here in the U.S.?
It has become that way.
It has become that way.
And just in the past 4 or 5 years, right? And obviously a lot of this began or was oxygenated by COVID, which meant that a lot of people couldn't move and a lot of people had to move, and it made things much more difficult for the Colombians, but it has become a political issue. And it's mainly a political issue focused on Venezuela and Venezuelan migrants. Because as you
Venezuela.
noted, they pass through Colombia. They can't afford. These are people who can't afford a plane ticket to get out of Caracas. They just can't.
Wow, and they have to trek on land.
Yeah.
Has any of the gang violence that has been wreaking havoc in Ecuador, the other side of Colombia, has that spilled over into Colombia? We actually did a podcast on that, and I learned what a huge issue that is in Ecuador.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with Ecuador. What I do know is that
I'm talking about the Colombian side. Has that become an issue in Colombia?
not really.
Gang. Oh, that's good.
No, but the Ecuadorians are now facing all kinds of problems that were common to Colombia 20 years ago or so, right?
Yeah,
Because it's money, it's drug trafficking, it's illegal movement of goods and people. Um, uh, People, where there's a huge demand for cocaine, whether it be in the United States or Western Europe, people will move the product to the market, no
yeah.
matter what. And if it's not the Colombians doing it, it will be the Ecuadorians or the Mexicans or people in Central America. It's uh I have a theory on this that nobody believes and nobody likes it when I say this. If we took a 20-year plan, took all the money out of the military, the police, right, and the judiciary, and put it all into public health and treatment, right, we'd solve the problem, right? But nobody wants to do that because who wants to invest in a 20-year plan when our political calendar is every 2 years or 4 years or so, right? So Plan LaRosa to solve the problem has never been taken up by anybody.
Dr.
Uh,
LaRosa, I don't want you to feel lonely in this plan because the Rand Corporation and many other prestigious think tanks, intellectual and institutions in the US going back, gosh, 30 some years, 40 years, have actually proposed this. I mean, not to the scale of get rid of our military or law enforcement when it comes to drug trade. No, no, that the issue is to solve this issue, we need to get rid of the market in America and then they'll stop. No military intervention
Yeah.
will nip this issue in the butt, if you will.
Right.
And so you're not alone in thinking that. Many others who have specifically studied these say this. Um, I've spent time in South America, and if you sit down and have a couple of beers and have a good, coffee, whatever, an intellectual conversation, you hear echoes of sentiments about anti-imperialism, even if the conversation is long enough, even towards the Spanish, going back to the 17th
Yeah.
and 16th centuries. But is there sort of anti-imperialism sentiments in in uh, Colombia now, or is that more back in the Che Guevara, 1960s, 1950s days? And I say this because I see the Che Guevara
Oh, yeah, you
poster in the
remember that.
back. Yeah,
Yeah. So
is
one of
that
my students gave me that. So David De La Fever, he's a professor in the United States. He traveled to Cuba and brought that back for me. And he also entered Cuba with Ronaldo Arenas' book before Nightfalls. They wouldn't let him into the country with that book. He was amazed at that.
what,
This is
tell us about that book? Why is that book an issue?
Well, it's a memoir by a Cuban writer who
Yeah.
died of HIV/AIDS in New York in the 90s, and who was controversial because he openly criticized Fidel Castro and the Castro's censorship. He was openly gay. He detested Fidel Castro and everything that Castro represented. But
So why would that book be an issue in Colombia?
no, he was in Cuba. He went
Oh,
to
Cuba.
Cuba,
Oh, I
yeah,
see. I
and
see.
that's where he got the Che poster. And he gave it to me when he visited Cuba. But there isn't. I would say, what would I say? I would say that Americans are completely comfortable. I mean, this could have all changed this past Sunday. But up until this past Sunday, Americans were welcomed in Colombia. There are no travel restrictions, there are no visa restrictions. You can just go there, and people have been enjoying Colombia recently since the FARC laid down their weapons in 2016. The tourism has grown exponentially. Colombian culture, music, art. 100 Years of Solitude is now a Netflix
It
series.
is. Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
wonderful. Good friend of mine stars in one of the roles, Manuel Sarmiento.
Oh,
It's it's
wonderful.
um it's the culture of the place. It's so rich, and it's been so, I don't want to say ignored, but it's been so hidden for so long because people have been afraid. So there really isn't an anti-imperialism sentiment. Now, when you go to the National University in Bogota, there are 18 to 20-year-old students who are a little wary of Americans, but once they get to know Americans, and once they apply for Fulbright grants and come to the United States, it changes their perspective. They don't fall in love with America necessarily, but they develop a more balanced, right, historically accurate perspective of how this all fits together. And it doesn't fit together easily. You have
It
to
doesn't.
study, you have to read and write and reflect. And that's what I always encourage my students to do, and travel. And that's the most
That's
important
that's
thing.
great. By the way, as far as travel, and I've witnessed in the last, I'd say, 5 to 6 years, you see a lot more travel documentaries, even on PBS, about the various insular islands off of Colombia. So
Yeah.
that's a big deal. So you mentioned this Sunday several times. You did it
Yeah.
in the first segment, and then again now. So let's talk about what happened this just past weekend. Um,
Hmm.
Mr. Trump is Mr. Trump is our president. I know we know what he was going to do. What I'm perplexed by from a diplomatic perspective is how President Petro of Colombia reacted, sending the planes back,
Yeah.
doing so publicly. Is there a backstory to this? Was he being pushed publicly to do this? It became a big deal. It almost became a crisis.
Anytime a military jet flies into Colombia or South America, it's a big deal. It's
Oh,
just it goes back to 1903. It goes back to I took Panama. It goes back to our military pushing around the people of Colombia. So it's an issue, right? And so
oh,
it's the optics more than anything else. These were people in Brazil too, who were coming off of these planes, off of the back of a cargo plane, right? chained and manacled at the ankles, right? Um, and it's a bad image for the Colombian media and for the Colombian people. So the question is, who are these people? They're our citizens. They're being returned from the United States. What horrible things did they do to deserve this kind of, they're almost like caged animals, right? What did they do? And we don't know the answer to that question, right?
Yeah.
All these really dangerous murderers and terrible people, or did they just overstay a tourist visa? We don't know, right? And so that's what Petro was saying. You can't treat our people like this, right? These are my citizens. This is my country. You cannot send these people here like caged animals on a military transport jet just for your own optics and so that you feel good about yourself. That was the crux of the argument. And Trump reacted and said, well, if you're going to turn the planes around, I'm going to hit you with a 50% tariff.
Yeah.
Effectively, Trump knew, President Trump knows that that would have crippled and crushed the Colombian economy in 30 days because 30% of all Colombian exports go to the United States.
Oh, wow. But that would have ultimately backfired because Colombia had the Colombian economy, collapsed. Now more immigration to the U.S., all sorts of just craziness.
Well, you're thinking like somebody who thinks forward and understands consequences. And, not everybody thinks that way rationally, right? But you're absolutely right, right? But it proved Mr. Trump understands that he has leverage and power and the power of the American economy. He can do these sort of things to a country like Colombia. Would he do this to Japan or or Brazil
China.
or China? Probably not, right?
Yeah.
Brazil is the eighth largest economy in the world. He's not going to do this with Brazil.
Yeah. Was this a shock, President Petro's response to Mr. Trump's action, deportation in such a manner? Was this a shock in Colombia?
Yeah,
It was.
it was. I mean, just
How Petro reacted.
right, and how they both reacted, and
Yeah.
how they both kind of how it just blew up so fast and on a Sunday.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
was
of all
it was
things.
of all things, it was just kind of amazing. And Petro, what do we say about Petro? He's pretty impulsive.
He
Uh,
is.
he's not a great negotiator. He doesn't like to sit down with others and listen, and he's not good at that. He's 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 not a great politician. He's wicked smart, right? There's my Bostonian coming out. He's a very smart guy. He knows how to speak. He's very charismatic, but he's not a very good leader. He's not good at bringing people together and getting things done. And his administration has been hamstrung by that. Right now, Colombian people, the Colombian critics of society and defenders of Petro say, well, that's the Colombian conservative mass, the Colombian conservative elite attacking him and making his presidency a failure. It's a little more complicated than that because Petro himself is not a super effective leader, has not been a super effective leader. And we knew that from when he was mayor of Bogota, right? His mayorship was not a huge success, and then he was elected president. He was elected president because the alternative candidate was he was terrible and
Terrible.
had no experience whatsoever running anything. So
So Colombians, even though they don't like the optics of their countrymen being in chains and manacles and all of
right.
that, they probably took a sigh of relief now that this spat was resolved. Probably.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because if 30% of your economy is going to be taxed at 50%, it's going to collapse those sectors of the economy. Cut flowers, coal, petroleum. We get a lot of petroleum from Colombia. Coffee. I mean, think about paying more for coffee. I mean, it was just a disaster. And then there are diplomatic implications too, because President Trump suspended visas for certain officials
Yeah.
in the Colombian government. That hasn't quite been resolved yet, but I think it will be. I think cooler heads are now prevailing now that President Trump has declared that he won this spat, as you put it, with Mr. Petro.
Yeah.
But Petro can't win. It's a small economy, and I'm not saying he shouldn't criticize Mr. Trump, but you got to be careful.
Yeah. If you wanted our audience to remember just one point about Colombian US relations, what would that one point be? What would you share?
I would say the one point would be that Colombian U.S. relations are complicated, and they back you have to know the history of both countries before you can really understand what's at work here. But Colombians oftentimes have distinct views from Americans on how history works and how they're perceived in history. They are people who are pro-American. They've been very grateful for the amount of support and solidarity that America has offered to them, but they recognize that they're a small country, and they want Americans to respect them and to understand a little bit about their country, and they want Americans to come visit.
Yeah. Dr. LaRosa, thank you so much for educating me and our audience. And to our audience, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you so
LaRosa.
much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's good to see you.
Same here.